In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take a recording like this and turn it into samples like these. So a couple months ago, I started my weekly newsletter called Free Samples Friday, where, as the name suggests, I give away free samples every single Friday. If you'd like to sign up, the link will be down below. And in response to Free Samples Friday, I recently got this email from my friend Paul Croteau from Yo Poly Music. Hey Mark, been enjoying your free samples and newsletter. About a year ago, I recorded some raw video of my Harley to toy with the samples. You were good at sound design. Thank you, Paul. Thought you might be interested in some audio to mess around with. I'd love to hear what sort of stuff you come up with. Maybe you can create some samples across the spectrum, shorts, perks, melodic, etc., the ingredients needed for a beat, and I could follow up with a beat using nothing but those samples. I'd be happy to crank something out and promote your mailing list. I've got the video and audio in a Logic package for easy consumption. Let me know if you're interested. So of course I was interested. This sounded like a really fun challenge. And after a few emails back and forth, Paul and I kind of came up with the idea that I would make the samples out of his Harley recording, and then he would allow me to use those for Free Samples Friday. And then in addition to that, I would make a video showing how I made those samples, and then he would make a video, using those samples to actually make a beat. So that being said, let's get right into it and jump into Logic, and I'll show you how I made these samples. All right, so here we are inside of Logic, and first let's just look at the initial recording quick, and I'll kind of show you what sounds I pulled from. So the full recording is about 1.5 minutes long, but there actually wasn't a ton of variety in the sounds to use, which kind of made it fun just to pick a few short samplings of this recording to kind of make all the samples from. So this first one, and I'm not sure what happened here, but the video actually doesn't start for quite a while, so I don't know if something happened in the transfer or what, but this first sound, I'll show you that here. So just that little bit, and you can see I kind of dragged it down here. And there's some more just engine revving with different sounds going on, and then there's a horn here. And then throughout here, there's a lot more engine sounds, and right here it looks like I pulled something. All right, and then down at the end here, we have some more sounds that I pulled from some of the buttons, the ignition switch, and then a full startup of the bike at the end. All right, first off, let's take a look at the kicks that I made. So I'll open this track stack here, and you can see I have a bunch of different failed experiments and just things I was testing out up at the top of this track stack. But if we scroll down, let's find the first kick, and I'll just see where this one starts. So it looks like I made this one from the ignition switch. So this is the sample that I pulled to start this kick sample. Go ahead and show you this quickly. I think that last click there is what I pulled. So moving down to this sample here, or this audio file here, you can see I transpose this down 15 semitones just to lower the pitch quite a bit, and that sounds like this. So instantly that's kind of sounding more like a usable kick, or at least, something to start a kick with. And what I like to do is if I transpose something, or if I'm changing the audio in any significant way, I like to bounce it in place. And if you're not a Logic user, all that means is basically just committing it to audio and like bouncing, or I don't really know another term for it, to be honest, just basically creating a new audio file with those changes committed. So bouncing that, we have this file here, and I'll turn off the effects. And that way I can just process the audio and kind of do it in stages. So the first thing I did to this here is add some R bass, and I'll pull this up. You kind of see just adding 43 hertz down low and just adding a lot of that low end. So that sounds like this. Again, without it. And next we have one of my favorite plugins to use on drum sounds is Decap's Knock plugin. So adding that sounds like this. I'm just adding some transient, which is the punch here, some saturation, a little bit of sub, that low F, and then doing some soft clipping. And lastly, we have some EQ, which looks like it didn't actually really use it all. So again, here's what it sounds like right now. And then bouncing that, and that actually was a final kick. So pretty simple sound. And then I know a lot of trap kicks, and I know that's kind of what Paul was going for, have a little bit more thud. So I think to make the second kick, all I did is take that same sample and then add some EQ, kind of cutting some frequencies out. So it sounds like this now. And then adding some knock again. So that's just a little bit of a different kick sound. And that leaves us with the second kick here. All right, and moving on to the third kick that I made here. This one actually started with the sampler instrument. So as you can see, this is titled Rev, which just means that I took one of the engine revving sounds. I'll go ahead and open this up so you can see. And I just moved the locators to take just a little bit of this sample, and that sounds like this. Then bouncing that to audio so I can start processing it. And the first thing I added is some R bass, again to add some low end. And then adding some knock, again, one of my favorite plugins, as I said. That just adds some transient punch, a little bit of saturation, again bringing in that low end sub, and then some soft clipping. And that gives us our third kick here. All right, and that's all for the kicks. Pretty simple and straightforward. All right, now moving on to the snares and rims that I created. Just go ahead and open this track stack here. And the first snare, this first one I wasn't really too proud of, so I kind of skipped this one. And honestly, the snares and the sample pack and this, experiment are probably the thing that I was least happy with how they turned out. But due to the time that I had, I couldn't really do more experiments. But the first one that I thought was decent started with this Rev sampler here. So we'll go ahead and open this. Again, just using Logic's quick sampler, taking a bit of the sample, sounds like this. All right, so bouncing that to audio, shortening it up, adding a fade, sounds like this. Kind of a short, punchy snare sound. And then for processing, if we throw on some R bass to give it a little bit more low end. And then next we have some transient master again, just taking a little bit of the attack down as well as the sustain. Some OTT again, just some compression. And then some EQ filtering. I think this is the same VR virtual right EQ filter that I had saved. Just kind of a nice tight punchy snare sound. And then bouncing that to audio, we have this. And then I threw on one of Cymatic's plugins called Diablo, which is a good drum processing plugin as well, with one of their presets, snare thick, and it sounds like this. All right, and that gives us the first snare sample that I made. All right, and then for the second snare, I actually just took this same bounce from this file here. You can see I just made a copy of it and then used a different preset in Cymatics because I think I had found two different presets that I liked. So this is using the snare thin preset. This is kind of like knock, where you can just add some punch, some boost, body heat, and they have different names, but really all you're doing is adjusting the transient, adding some compression, some saturation, some clipping, just slightly different sound, different user face, but really they do similar things, just again with slightly different sound. So just for context, here is the first one that we made, and then the second preset sounds like this. So different sound, although it's coming from the same audio source. So this created snare 02. All right, and then moving on to the third snare that I made. It started with this sampler instrument here, which is the startup Rev, you can see, and that sounds like this. So bouncing that to audio and turning off the processing, we have this. Just shortening that up and adding an audio fade here, as you can see. And then throwing on some EQ, just cutting out some of the low end, and then throwing on some OTT. This is just a perk setting, as you can see. This is made, a preset I made a long time ago for actually orchestral percussion, but I found it sounds good on a lot of different drum sounds. Bouncing that to audio, we have this here, and I'll turn off the processing. Now on this one, adding some OTT again in that same preset, so squashing it a bit more. And then throwing on some Saturn, and actually it looks like this is the same VR processing, the virtual right snare processing that I showed earlier, same EQ filtering, and then some transient master again, just bringing up the attack but bringing down the sustain. I think I was trying to get rid of some of that tail there. And then adding knock again, and this is just adding a little bit more to the transient, making it punch a little bit more, adding some saturation, some top end air, and then a tiny little bit of soft clipping. And that leaves us with snare 03. Again, the snares were probably what I felt weakest about with these, but you know, when you're doing these sort of challenges, you only have the source material to work with that you have. So, all right, so now moving down to the rim sounds or the rim shot sounds, I use the buttons that you saw in the video earlier. So there's 3 different buttons here. I'll let you hear what those sound like again. So then I just dragged each one of those down and made a rim shot out of each. So the first button we have here with no processing, and then I transposed that down 12 semitones, so just down a full octave. The first thing I added is some EQ here. You can see just kind of boosting right around 345 hertz, just giving a little bit of bump in that lower area. And then Spectre here, just adding a little bit more low end warmth. Then bounce that to audio, and I did transpose it down another 5 semitones. Sounds like this. And then adding on some knock, just adding a little bit of transient punch, some saturation, some top end air, and some soft clipping again. Bouncing that in place, we have this sound. And then adding some EQ. I think there's a resonant bump here, yep, that I cut out right here. Just kind of cutting through a little bit and then boosting 746 hertz here, boosting this area a little bit, just kind of even out the sound a little bit. And that leaves us with the first rim shot sound. All right, and then we have the second button here. I'll take off the processing. Kind of a high clicky sound. Then adding some OTT. Just kind of squashing the sound a little bit. And then transient master here. Just pulling down the attack a little bit and pushing up the sustain to try and get a little bit more of that rim shot type sound. And then again, we have some knock, just adding some saturation and some clipping. And then some EQ filtering here, just kind of shaping the sound. Bouncing that to audio, and then transpose down 4 semitones. Adding knock, just a little bit more saturation, some air, and then some more clipping. And that leaves us with the second rim shot sound. All right, and now the third button here, and right away I transpose this one down 10 semitones. And adding in some OTT, some compression. Just kind of squashing the sound a little bit. Bouncing that to audio, we have this sound. And I transpose that down another 4 semitones, adding some knock, just a little bit of punch again. As you can see, a lot of this is pretty repetitive, but it's just doing a lot of the same processing in stages. So again, adding some transient punch, a little bit of saturation, and then some soft clipping, and bouncing that to audio. We have this sound, and then throwing on some EQ, just doing some pretty extreme boosting and cutting there to kind of even out the sound. And that leaves us with Rimshot 3. All right, now moving on to the clap samples. Go ahead and open this track stack here. And for this, I started with a engine revving sound again. So we'll open up this sampler. And this is the sound I started with. Now for this, what I did is first obviously bounce that to audio. We are left with this. And then I threw on some knock. And then what I did with this is intentionally squashed it as much as possible. And I'll show you why in a second. It'll make a lot more sense because I wanted to just make it basically as loud as possible and reduce all dynamic range so that I could basically redraw the dynamics with my own volume shaping. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So again, adding knock and just absolutely pushing it as hard as I could into the clipper here and adding some saturation and punch and top end air and really just destroying the sound, but very intentionally. So that leaves us with this. Then what I did is take that sound and add some EQ filtering to kind of get it more in that clap range, which gives us this. So you can see it's a little bit closer, but then what really gives it that clap sound is by using the shaper box here, and you can use any tool you want. This is just what I decided to use, and basically draw in volume automation. And if you're creating claps in a synthesizer using noise, this is the same shape that you would draw when you design a clap. Basically just 4 sharp spikes like this, and that leaves us with this sound. So it instantly sounds a lot more like a clap. And like I said, this is basically how you make a clap in a synthesizer. It's just instead of using audio, you'd be using the noise oscillator. And so you just adjust the rate to whatever, works best for you. And again, that sounds like this. So bouncing that to audio, we are left with this sound here again. Then throwing on some knock, just adding some punch, some saturation, some top end air, and a little bit of clipping like always. All right, and then we have some filtering, EQ, just kind of get it more in that clap range. And that leaves us with clap number 1. Now for clap 2, I just took the same file here and made a copy of it, and then just used a different timing and shaper box. So just, kind of gives it a different sound. Again, bounce that to audio, we're left with this. Adding in some knock with the typical processing, just adding some punch, some saturation, some air, some clipping. As you can see, it gets a bit repetitive, but a lot of this is just trial and error, and you find a plugin that works for you, and kind of find the processing that works for you, and you can find that a lot of different sounds can use the same tools, especially when it comes to drums and percussion. So then throwing on some EQ, just kind of getting in that clap range again, and that gives us clap number 2 here. All right, and then clap number 3 was just, again, a different timing of that, volume automation, which left us with this. And then adding some knock. Just again, all the same processing as pretty much every time I use knock, just, adjusting it to taste for each sound. And then some EQ filtering. And we have clap number 3. All right, now moving into the hi-hats here, and now we're going to get to a little bit different processing. I know the kick, snares, and claps were a little bit repetitive with the processing, but now we'll kind of get into some different techniques here. And I remember when I made the hi-hats, I had quite a different experiments that I tried. Some of them didn't turn out very well. I won't waste your time going through all these, but that's kind of part of the sound design process. It's just a lot of trial and error. So I'll scroll all the way down, and if you're wondering, some of these they had like weird resonances and they didn't sound very good. And so after a lot of experiments, we'll go down all the way. So it looks like this is hat 1. So this is the first one that I was happy with. I'll kind of just scroll back to where this one started. And it looks like this one actually started with one of the buttons again. So the original sound that I used for hat number 1 was right here. Just again, one of those button sounds that you heard earlier. Throwing on some EQ filtering to just really cut out basically everything below 1700 hertz to kind of keep it in that hi-hat range. All right, and then I threw on some reverb with Native Instruments ROM, just using the tight drums preset and bouncing that to audio. From there, I threw on transient master again, just really bringing up the sustain because that was such a short little button click that I kind of wanted to make it a little bit of a longer sample, bring the sustain out. All right, and then we throw on some Valhalla vintage verb at 100% wet. Sounds like this. Just really makes that sample a lot longer, obviously, with that reverb on. And then some more EQ filtering to just keep it in that hi-hat range again. All right, and then bouncing that to audio, kind of shortening it up and adding a fade. We're left with this. And then as you can see, I added 26 dB of gain because that was a really quiet sample. And then adding in knock, just adding some transient punch, a little bit of saturation, and some clipping. Getting a little bit closer to a hi-hat sound. And then some EQ, just again, filtering everything out, kind of keeping it right in that upper hi-hat range. And then adding on some more reverb with the Verb Suite Classics, just having a percussive plate there. Or the perk plate preset, sorry. All right, then bouncing that to audio, shortening it up and adding a fade. We're left with this sound. And then I believe this one, I think I just made another variation of it. So just adding a fade at a different length, we have this sound. And then throwing on some EQ here, just adding a high shelf. And then some more EQ filtering. Some transient master. Just really bring the sustain down. bouncing that to audio, we're left with this, and then shortening it up and adding another fade. And that's actually a pretty decent hi-hat sound now, so that leaves us with hi-hat 1. All right, for the second hi-hat sample, I just took one of these bounces. I don't remember which. I wasn't super organized with this because I was just trying a bunch of different stuff. But basically just shortened one of the samples, added a fade, transposed it down 6 semitones, and then added some knock again, just adding some transient punch, some saturation, some top end air, and a tiny little bit of soft clipping there. That sounds like this, and that gives us hi-hat number 2. All right, and then to make the open hi-hat sounds, I took the hi-hat number 1 that we made, and then adding on some big reverb to that. Sounds like this. All right, so bouncing that to audio, we are left with this, and then adding some gain. And then I added some shaper box to just sort of shape the volume of an open hi-hat sound, and we have this. All right, and then bouncing that to audio, and adding a fade and kind of cutting off the end click, we have this. And that leaves us with open hi-hat number 1. Then the open hi-hat number 2, I just took that same reverb bounce and did a different, volume automation and shaper box, which leaves us with this. Just a little bit of a longer sound. And again, same thing, cut off the end, click at the end, and did a volume automation of fade out. Sounds like this. And that leaves us with open hat number 2. All right, and now moving on to the 808s that I created. We'll open this track stack here. And these started again with one of the Rev sampler instruments that I created. Open that and let you hear what that sounds like. So that's the original sound that I used. And bouncing that to audio. Turn off the processing here. Again, that sounds like this. And then adding in some EQ filtering, just cut out a lot of the top end. Just really kind of leave us down at that low 808 range. Adding in some R bass to add even more low end at 41 Hertz. That sounds like this. All right, and then adding in knock again, just adding in some punch, enhancing the transient, some saturation, adding in some low sub, that low E at 41 Hertz, and then some soft clipping. That sounds like this. Kind of getting more of an 808 sound there. And then lastly, we have some EQ filtering, just cutting out a lot of the top end again. That sounds like this. Kind of getting more like an 808. Bouncing that to audio here and transposing down 8 semitones. Sounds like this. Bouncing that again to audio because I like to bounce every time I transpose or do anything. Like I said, that leaves us with this sound here. And then adding Cymatics Diablo again. And just using one of their 808 presets, 808 heat, and then kind of tweaking some of the settings to get the sound that I wanted. That sounds like this. Kind of gives it some high-end grit. And then bouncing that to audio, and that leaves us with the first 808 sample. All right, and then for the second 808 sample, it looks like I took the same audio file and just did some different processing. So really making it a much shorter, tighter 808 at first, shortening that sample and adding a volume fade. And I'll turn off the processing. That sounds like this. All right, a much shorter, punchier 808. And then adding some knock. So we're adding some punch, some saturation, some of that low sub at 55 Hertz, some top end air, and a little bit of soft clipping there. Kind of a decent starting 808 sound. Adding in some Saturn 2, and again, we're splitting right here at this frequency at 305 Hertz, so I'm only adding saturation above that. Sounds like this. All right, and then adding some waves max bass, and this just kind of brings out some of the upper harmonics of the bass as well. And then adding in another instance of knock, so a little bit more punch and bringing out the sub a little bit more, and then even more soft clipping. It looks like a little bit of filtering here, so taking out some of that top end. That sounds like this. If you're listening on a phone, you're probably not hearing a lot of this stuff, so I would suggest using headphones or good speakers to kind of hear a lot of this low end stuff. But bouncing that to audio, we're left with this sound here. And then one more instance of knock on there, just adding yet a little bit more punch, bringing out that sub even a little bit more, and then some more soft clipping. And that leaves us with this sound. All And that is the second 808 sample. All right, and then for the third 808 sample, I started with this sampler instrument here. You can see that's the original sound right there. Bouncing that to audio, we're left with this. And as you can hear in this sample, the pitch kind of bends down quite a bit. So what I actually did is several stages of Melodyne to sort of try and keep a more consistent pitch. So the first instance of Melodyne sounds like this, kind of cutting out that pitch down a little bit, bouncing that to audio. We have this, then adding another instance of Melodyne to sort of even out that pitch. It's a little bit more even, and that leaves us with this. And then I took that sample and created another sampler instrument, which sounds like this. Then bouncing that to audio and shortening the sample and adding a fade at the end, pitching it up 4 semitones, sounds like this. And then what I did is add some R bass, kind of bring out the lower frequencies again, right at 41 hertz. It really adds that low end. Some EQ filtering to cut out some of the top end. And then knock again. With this, we're just adding some punch, some saturation, some low end, bringing out 41 hertz again, and a little bit of top end and some clipping. All right, and then bouncing that to audio, and I'm glad I labeled this because going back over all these audio files, sometimes I can forget what I did. But in this sample, you can hear there's sort of a double attack, like the sound kind of hits twice. And so what I did is cut it out at the second attack, and that leaves us with this sound here. Oops, I'll turn off the processing. Sounds like this. We throw on some R bass, just bringing out again 41 hertz, boosting that up. As you'll see, a lot of the stuff gets pretty repetitive, but I do it in stages because if you just try and do everything at once, it doesn't work out and you're going to overkill the sound. So I like to make little incremental changes that get me closer and closer to the sound I'm going for. So again, adding some low end sounds like this. Then adding knock again, just a little bit of saturation, bringing out that low 41 hertz even a little bit more, kind of dialing that sound in a little bit more, adding a tiny bit of top end and some soft clipping. Actually, this actually looks like pretty hard clipping. You can see the slider is slid over to the right, so it's going to be a little bit more aggressive. All right, then bouncing that to audio, and it looks like all I did is add a fade so it doesn't click, so we're left with this sound. And that is the third 808 sample. All right, now moving on to the Pluck samples, I'll go ahead and open this track stack here. And for these, I started with one of the horn recordings and made a sampler instrument. I'll pull up that here so you can hear what it sounds like. Bouncing that to audio, we have this sound here. And as you can see, it's a little bit heavy on the right side. So the first thing I did is add this great plugin from Boom Audio or Boom Library, whatever the company is called Recenter. It just kind of fixes the stereo image. So it sounds like this. Kind of brings it more to the center, obviously. Bouncing that to audio, we're left with this. Next, I just added some guitar rig. Figured maybe try some like guitar pedal type sounds on it. Just found a preset that I liked and tweaked it to my needs. This Massive Wall of Rock preset. And that sounds like this. Then bouncing that to audio and adding a fade. And then adding some EQ processing to really filter a lot of stuff out. That sounds like this. Then bouncing that to audio again, shortening it up, adding a fade. Sounds like this. So then what I did is throw on a big reverb to make it sound like this. And then on top of that, I threw on some OTT to really even out the sound and really just squash that sound with the reverb. Then bouncing that to audio, shortening it up and adding a fade again, sounds like this. And then from there, I went ahead and added some knock, just adding some transient punch, some saturation, a little bit of top end to air, and some soft clipping. Sounds like this. And bouncing that to audio. All right, and then what I did is actually created a sampler instrument from that. And the reason I did this is because I knew it wasn't in tune. And so if you use the optimized version of Logic's Quick Sampler, and I'm sure most DAWs can do this, you can see it automatically pitch it down 13 cents, brings it in tune, and then just rebounce that. So I have a tuned pluck sound here. All right, and that leaves us That leaves us with the Pluck 01G, which you can find in the Free Samples Friday download. So then to make another Pluck sound, what I did is take that same sample and then first add some decapitator. All right, and then adding some Valhalla vintage verb. Then adding some more decapitator to sort of distort the reverb. Then adding some EQ filtering. And then again adding some more OTT to really just squash the sound. All right, then bouncing that to audio, shortening up the sample and adding an audio fade leaves us with this. And there's Pluck 02G, which you can also find in the Free Samples Friday download. All right, now for the third pluck, I actually started with one of the Rev sampler instruments that I actually copied, it looks like from the 808 folder maybe. That sounds like this. Kind of a buzzy sound. Bouncing that to audio, shortening it up and adding a fade. We are left with this. Doing some EQ filtering, looks like maybe just taking out some of the low end. All right, then I threw on Surfer EQ2, which this is one of my favorite plugins for sound design as well, specifically just for this harmonic filter here. You can see I tuned this to 261 Hertz, which is a low C, kind of boosted these harmonic resonances, and that sounds like this. Kind of just forces some tonality and pitch to a sample if you're doing some sound design work. Bouncing that to audio and adding a fade again leaves us with this. And then doing some EQ filtering, again, just cutting out low end. Bouncing that to audio leaves us with this. So I then took that sample and made another sampler instrument, which you can see here. And that sounds like this. Bouncing that to audio, we have this sound. And then adding some EQ filtering, just kind of pulling out some nasty resonances and just kind of shaping the sound. And then we have some OTT to squash the sound a little bit. A little bit of Soothe too to take out some of the harshness. Then again, bouncing that to audio and adding a fade to sort of shape the sound. And then adding some EQ filtering and some decapitator to distort it. Some transient master, pulling down the attack a little bit and boosting the sustain. Again, just to shape the sound a little bit more to what I was going for. Then again, adding a big reverb, and I think this was just to kind of try and soften the sound a little bit. That sounds like this. Then adding some compression with this Supercharger GT plugin from Native Instruments. All right, bouncing that to audio and adding a fade to shape the sound again leaves us with this. All right, then with that bounce, adding some knock. Just adding some transient punch, some saturation, a little bit of top end air, and some soft clipping. Sounds like this. And then when we bounce that to audio, that leaves us with Pluck 03. All right, and last but not least, let's go ahead and take a look at the atmosphere samples that I created. So the first atmosphere actually started with one of the Rev samplers. So I'll pull that up here and you can hear what I started with. So bouncing that to audio, here's our starting sample. Then what I did with this is to run some Melodyne just to kind of tighten up the tuning a little bit. All right, then bouncing that to audio, this is where things start to get fun as far as sound design goes. I threw on some black hole reverb, which sounds like this, using the Sigur Rós preset. Okay, and then just some EQ filtering, kind of shaping the sound. And then this is one of my favorite sound design tricks is on this black hole reverb, they actually have this freeze button here, which actually will freeze the reverb and just keep it going forever. And then also if you use this plugin called Rolling Sampler, you can set it up. Basically what it does is it records everything on a loop, but it doesn't take up a bunch of space on your computer because it only saves the recordings if you pull them out of there. So I'll just show you an example of what I did. I'll just recreate this quick. So if we pull up, open the black hole reverb, and then what I'm going to do is reset the duration. That way it'll start at the beginning. I'll just choose 4 minutes and then we'll play the sound. I'm just going to explain it so you can see it in real time and I'm not talking over it. I'm going to play the sound, hit freeze on the reverb. It's just going to record a long kind of sustained note of this reverb. And then I'm going to drag that back into my DAW, which is basically just resampling. So go ahead and do that. And yeah, you get the point. That'll just keep going on and on and on for as long as you want. So then what you can do is take this just by selecting this chunk here, dragging that into your DAW. Again, basically just like resampling, which you can do in most DAWs. This is just a lot easier and faster way to do it. And I like having this plugin on all the time because it's always recording what I'm doing. So if I make a cool sound, I can instantly just grab it out of Rolling Sampler. So that's how I created the next sound we're going to look at. And then what I basically did is just took a part of the middle where the sound was more consistent and it didn't have the initial attack, and added some EQ. So it sounds, well, I'll show you the original sound. It sounds like this. So I think I let that record for a couple minutes and then just kind of chose a big long chunk in the middle. Threw on some EQ to sort of filter it how I wanted. Pulled out some of that resonance there. Then again, threw on Surfer EQ and using that harmonic filter, tuning it to G. Sounds like this. And then throwing on EQ, kind of really just boosting that G here to kind of force that pitch and tonality. All right, so bouncing that to audio, I threw on some Melodyne. As you can see, Melodyne actually detected several pitches. So I just took all these E flats and all these other pitches down below and shut those off with the amplitude tool. And that sounds like this. The reason I did that is I just wanted just a really focused pitch. That way when I sample it later, it's not going to get messy if I create chords or anything like that. So then bouncing that to audio, we're left with this. And if I pull up my tuner here, you can see it's just a little bit sharp. So what I did is threw on the Sound Shifter plugin to sort of just adjust for that, doing -8 cents. And that brings the sample much more in tune, kind of keeps it more consistent. So bouncing that to audio, we're left with this. All right, so that's Atmosphere G you can find in the download folder. And I created this basically just as a starting point to create the other atmospheres. So turning that into a sampler instrument, we have this here, and then you can actually play chords with it. As you can see, I just made a big F minor chord. All right, so bouncing that to audio, we're left with this. And then from there, I just added some movement by output, which is a really great plugin for this sort of sound design work. I just found a preset that I liked and probably just tweaked a little bit of the settings to my needs. Sounds like this. Then added some Valhalla shimmer. Then just some EQ filtering to shape the sound. And that leaves us with the processed F minor atmosphere that, again, you can find in the Free Samples Friday download folder. All right, that does conclude all of the samples that I made for this challenge. Again, a big shout out and thank you to my friend Paul Croteau from Yo Poly Music for thinking of this, reaching out to me with this awesome idea. This was a lot of fun. Make sure you go check out his video as well to see the beat that he made with these samples. Hopefully this video was helpful. I know I zoomed through a lot of this stuff pretty quickly, but there was a lot of different sounds to get through. So if there's anything you want me to dig deeper into, feel free to leave a comment below and I can make another tutorial or answer your questions. Thank you again, of course, to Paul for thinking of this idea. This challenge is a lot of fun. If you want all of these samples for free, like I said, go ahead and sign up for Free Samples Friday with the link down below. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.